I want you to picture a pair of hands. Not young, smooth hands, but hands that have seen 70 years of work. The skin is like parchment, mapped with the blue rivers of veins, and the fingertips are calloused, hardened by decades of pressing against steel and wood. These hands belong to a man named Arthur. Arthur was the kind of man you might walk past in the grocery store without a second glance. He wore a beige coat, even in the summer, and he always smelled faintly of lemon oil and sawdust. He lived in a world of silence, or so it seemed to his neighbors. But Arthur didn't hear silence. He heard potential. He heard the music sleeping inside things that the rest of the world had decided were broken. He was a retired luthier, a maker and fixer of instruments, living in a small town that was slowly forgetting the value of mending things. But Arthur's quiet life was about to be interrupted by a noise he couldn't ignore. It started on a damp Tuesday morning, a day so gray it made his old bones ache with every step. He almost missed it completely. It was just a flyer, crumpled into a wet ball in the muddy gutter outside the old community center, looking like a piece of trash that the world had chewed up and spit out. To Arthur, it already felt like a treasure map. Arthur smoothed out the flyer on his kitchen table. It was an announcement for a modernization auction. The town council had decided to renovate the old center. They wanted sleek glass, digital kiosks, and open spaces. To make room, they were selling off the antiques. Listed right at the top was Item 4B, grand piano. Condition, poor, non-functional. Arthur knew that piano. It was a 1920s Steinway, sitting in the dusty corner of the assembly hall for as long as anyone could remember. It had been silent for 20 years, its lid sealed like a heavy vault, piled high with old magazines and lost coats. The auction was in 3 days. The starting bid was $50. Scrap value. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest. He wasn't a wealthy man. His pension barely covered his heating bill. But the thought of that piano being chopped up for firewood or turned into a trendy bookshelf made his stomach turn. He drank his coffee, staring at the flyer. He decided he would just go and look at it. Just one look. He didn't know then that walking through those double doors would put him on a collision course with the most powerful man in town. And you won't believe who was standing guard right next to the piano when he arrived. The man standing by the piano was Marcus. Marcus was the new director of the center. He was young, efficient, and constantly checking his smartwatch. He saw the world in spreadsheets. If it didn't make money, it didn't make sense. Arthur approached the piano slowly. He asked Marcus if he could open the lid. Marcus sighed, tapping his foot, and said, "Be quick, old timer. The haulers are coming to estimate the weight for removal this afternoon." Arthur lifted the heavy mahogany lid. The smell of dust and old felt hit him. It was the smell of a forgotten memory. He looked inside. The strings were rusted. The hammers were moth-eaten. It was a wreck. But then Arthur saw it. Etched into the iron frame, barely visible under the grime, were initials. EM 1945. Arthur froze. He knew those initials. They belonged to Elias Miller, a legendary local teacher who had played for the troops returning from the war. This wasn't just furniture. This was the town's history. Arthur ran his thumb over the letters. He knew he had to save it. But how? He turned to Marcus and made an offer. But Marcus didn't just say no. He laughed. And what he said next shattered Arthur's hope completely. Marcus told Arthur that the piano was already promised to a developer who wanted the ivory keys and the wood veneer. The deal was done verbally. The auction was just a formality. "It's obsolete, Arthur," Marcus said, not unkindly, but with a brutal practicality. "We're trying to keep this place alive, Arthur, and nostalgia doesn't pay the bills." Arthur left the center, feeling smaller than he ever had. He walked home under the gray sky. He felt foolish. He was just an old man with a toolbox full of obsolete tools. Why did he think he could stop the march of progress? He sat in his armchair, listening to the ticking of his grandfather clock. He tried to accept it. He tried to tell himself it was just a thing. But the silence in his house felt heavy. It felt like an accusation. He remembered a fact he had read once. A standard grand piano string is under about 160 pounds of tension. Even when silent, the instrument is holding back a tremendous amount of energy, waiting to be released. Arthur felt exactly like that string. He was under tension. He couldn't let it go. He stood up. He wasn't going to buy the piano. He couldn't afford it. He was going to do something much more dangerous. He grabbed his coat, but he needed a way back inside after hours. And he remembered the one person who might help him if he could just swallow his pride. Arthur went to the back entrance of the center, where the janitor, a man named Sam, was taking a smoke break. Sam and Arthur went way back. They played chess in the park on Sundays. Arthur explained the situation. He didn't want to steal the piano. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to make it sing one last time before the auction on Friday. If people heard it, if they really heard it, maybe they wouldn't let it be destroyed. Sam looked at Arthur like he was crazy. "You have 3 nights," Sam said. "If Marcus catches you, I lose my job and you go to jail for trespassing." Arthur nodded. "I know." Sam handed him a spare key card. It felt heavy in Arthur's hand. This was it. He was breaking the rules. He was crossing a line. That night, at 11 p.m., Arthur slipped into the darkened hall. He turned on a single flashlight. He opened his tool bag. The silence of the large room was spooky. He approached the piano. He lifted the lid. He had 3 nights to undo 20 years of neglect. He reached for his tuning wrench. But as soon as he touched the first pin, a loud noise echoed from the hallway. Arthur froze. He cut the light. Footsteps clicked on the linoleum floor. It was the security guard doing his rounds. Arthur scrambled under the piano bench, squeezing his old frame into the shadows. The flashlight beam swept across the room, dancing over the dust motes. It lingered on the piano. Arthur held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The guard muttered something about the heating bill and walked on. The door clicked shut. Arthur exhaled. He was shaking. He almost packed up right then. This was too much for a man of 72. But then he looked at the strings again. He thought of Elias Miller playing for soldiers who had seen too much darkness. He thought of the healing power of that music. He took a deep breath and began to work. He started with the hammers, filing the felt, reshaping them. It was grueling work. His arthritis flared up. His fingers cramped. But he worked through the pain. By 4 a.m., he had finished the middle octave. He was exhausted, but he felt alive. He packed up and snuck out. But the next morning, when he went to the grocery store, he ran into Marcus. And Marcus looked at him with a strange suspicion in his eyes. What did Marcus know? Marcus didn't accuse him of anything, but he mentioned that the ghost seemed restless at the center. "Things are moved around," Marcus said, narrowing his eyes. "I found a piece of sandpaper on the floor." Arthur kept his face blank. "Must be the wind," Arthur said. He walked away, his heart racing. He realized he had been careless. He had to be perfect. On the second night, the work was even harder. He had to tune the strings. This was the delicate part. He couldn't make noise. He had to pluck the strings so softly, barely a whisper, feeling the vibration more than hearing the note. It was a test of every skill he had ever learned. As he worked, Sam the janitor came in to mop. Sam stopped and watched. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Sam whispered, "My mother used to play this piano before she got sick." Arthur looked up. He saw tears in Sam's eyes. This wasn't just Arthur's mission anymore. It was for Sam, too. It was for everyone who had forgotten. They shared a nod. But just as Arthur finished the treble section, the main lights of the hall suddenly blazed on. It wasn't Marcus. It was the cleaning crew, arriving early for a deep clean before the auction. Arthur barely had time to throw a tarp over his tools and pretend he was sleeping on a bench in the lobby, waiting for the center to open. They bought his story about being confused and losing track of time. But it was a close call. Too close. He had 1 night left. The bass strings were still dead. The action was sticky. And the auction was the next morning at 9 a.m. Arthur went home and collapsed. He was running on fumes. He doubted himself. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the past should stay buried. Maybe nobody cared about an old wooden box. He turned on the radio. A radio host was talking about how doctors were finally admitting what musicians had always known, that music keeps the mind alive longer than silence ever could. It was a sign. Music wasn't just a hobby. It was health. It was life. Arthur stood up. He wouldn't give up. But when he arrived at the center for the final night, the key card didn't work. The light on the reader turned red. Marcus must have deactivated the lost cards. Arthur stood in the rain, water dripping off the brim of his hat. He was locked out. The piano was unfinished. The bass notes would sound like thuds. If he couldn't finish, the performance would be a disaster. He pounded on the door gently, hoping Sam was there. No answer. He walked around the perimeter, testing windows. All locked. He felt a profound sense of failure. He had come so close. He sat on the wet steps, his head in his hands. He thought about going home. It would be easier. He could just sleep. But then he remembered the initials. EM. He remembered Sam's mother. He remembered the tension in the strings waiting to be released. He looked up and saw a small bathroom window on the second floor was cracked open just an inch. It was a dangerous climb. He was 72. One slip and he would break a hip, or worse. He looked at the trellis covered in ivy. He put his foot on the first rung. He had to ask himself, was a piano worth the ultimate risk? He began to climb, forcing his stiff limbs to move against gravity. The old trellis would groan loudly under his weight, threatening to snap into splinters with every step he took. The ivy was wet and slippery against his shaking fingers, slick with rain and moss. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps that burned his lungs like fire. For a second, his foot slipped on a wet leaf, leaving him dangling by one arm before he found his footing again. He finally reached the window and pulled himself through, barely controlling his fall as his knees slammed hard into the cold tile, the impact sending a sharp jolt of pain up his legs. He lay there for a moment, checking for broken bones. He was bruised but whole. He crept down the stairs. He entered the hall. It was 2 a.m. He had 4 hours. He worked with a feverish intensity. He regulated the action. He voiced the hammers. He tuned the bass strings, pulling them tight, feeling the immense power of the instrument returning. The piano was waking up. It was breathing. By 6 a.m., he was done. He sat at the bench. He put his hands on the keys. He wanted to play just one chord to hear it, but he couldn't risk it. He packed his tools. He cleaned every speck of dust. He polished the wood until it shone like dark glass. He left the lid open, revealing the gleaming gold plate and the new red felt. He hid in the storage closet. He would wait for the auction. But as the sun rose, he heard voices. The developer had arrived early with Marcus, and they had brought a heavy iron hammer. The developer, a man named Mr. Sterling, wanted to break the legs off the piano to make it easier to move through the door. "It's junk anyway," Sterling said. "We're just stripping the ivory." Marcus nodded, handing him the iron hammer. Arthur watched from the crack in the closet door. His heart stopped. They weren't going to auction it. They were going to dismantle it right there. All his work, all his risk. It was for nothing. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He was just an old man. He had no authority. If he stepped out, he would be arrested. He saw Sterling lift the heavy hammer. The metal gleamed in the morning light. Arthur closed his eyes. He couldn't watch. He prepared to hear the crunch of wood. But then, a sound cut through the air. Not a crunch. A voice. "Stop." It was Arthur. He had burst out of the closet. He stood between the man and the piano. He was shaking, disheveled, his clothes stained with grease and rain. Marcus looked shocked. "Arthur, how did you get in here?" Arthur ignored him. He looked at Sterling. "You can't destroy this," Arthur said, his voice trembling but loud. "It's not junk. It's a masterpiece." Sterling laughed. "It's a rotted box, Grandpa. Move aside." Marcus stepped forward, angry now. "Arthur, you're trespassing. I'm calling the police." He pulled out his phone. Arthur didn't move. He backed up until he touched the keys. "Just listen," Arthur pleaded. "Just listen to it." Marcus dialed 3 numbers. "No," Marcus said coldly. "It's over." The security guard grabbed Arthur's arm to drag him away. Arthur fought, his heels skidding on the floor. He was being pulled away from the bench. He had failed, but in the struggle, his hand struck the keys. It wasn't a melody. It was a chaotic crash of notes. But the sound was thunderous. It was rich, resonant, and incredibly clear. The bass notes growled like a storm. The treble rang like crystal bells. The sound filled the room, bouncing off the high ceiling, startling everyone into silence. The security guard let go. Sterling lowered the hammer. Marcus froze, his phone halfway to his ear. The echo hung in the air, vibrating in their chests. It was the sound of a living thing. Arthur straightened his coat. He sat down on the bench. He didn't ask for permission this time. He closed his eyes and began to play. He played Chopin, the Raindrop Prelude. The notes fell like heavy rain after a long drought, soft and steady, washing away 20 years of dust and neglect. Then his hands found a strength he hadn't felt in decades, swelling the melody into a storm of absolute passion that shook the floorboards. The music didn't just tell a story, it screamed the history of the war, whispered the relief of the peace, cried out the pain of the long silence, and celebrated the glory of the return. As Arthur played, the auction crowd began to filter in. They stopped at the door, mesmerized. Sam the janitor stood in the back, smiling. He saw tears streaming down Marcus's face. Marcus, the man of spreadsheets, was crying. He was remembering something he thought he had lost, maybe his own humanity, maybe the music his grandmother used to play. The music stripped away the cynicism of the room. When Arthur hit the final chord, the room was absolutely silent. Nobody moved. Then, slowly, Sterling put the iron hammer on the floor. "I can't cut that up," he muttered. "It would be a sin." Marcus turned away, embarrassed by the moisture in his eyes, as if angry at himself for feeling anything at all. He looked at Arthur, really looked at him, for the first time. He canceled the auction for item 4B. He declared the piano a permanent fixture of the new center. He turned to Arthur and asked, "Who tuned this?" Arthur just smiled and rubbed his tired hands. "It just needed someone to listen," he said. Arthur walked home that day, empty-handed but full of heart. He didn't own the piano, but he had saved it, and that was enough. The center reopened a month later. The piano sits in the lobby now, polished and proud. Kids play on it. Old folks gather around it. It's the heartbeat of the building. Arthur goes there sometimes, just to sit and listen. He knows that sooner or later, the strings will go out of tune again. And when they do, he'll be ready with his bag. Because he knows the truth. Nothing is truly broken until we stop loving it. And as Arthur walks past the piano now, hearing children and strangers bring it back to life, he knows something simple and true. Nothing is ever really broken until the world decides it no longer wants to listen.